I burned the pancakes again, and the sweet smell turning bitter climbed the rafters like an accusation I could not set down. And while the youngest kept thudding his muddy boots against the table, I had planed with these same hands, and the middle pair collided in a tangle of elbows in mock fury, and the eldest worked at becoming stone because he thought hardness was the only shape a boy could grow into without his mother. I understood with a dull, clean fright that what sat on this ridge was not a home, but a shell where 6 males slept and woke and endured, because the woman who knew how to turn breath into song had been gone 3 winters, and I had mistaken survival for fatherhood. And the ring I could never bring myself to remove. The thin circle of promise that had not thinned with the years caught the pale light and flashed like memory so sharp it made me blink, and I heard myself repeating the vows I had spoken into the hot, still air of that room the day Sarah's hand went slack in mine. Brave words that sounded easy beside a dying bed and impossible afterward. And I saw how far I had drifted from the man who spoke them. My son stood like a weather map of my failures, if anybody had cared to read them. Wyatt staring at the floor because anger gives a boy something to carry when his mother's voice has nowhere to land. Liam holding a book like a shield because printed pages can be a room only one person knows how to enter. Owen turning grief into rough play, as if a prank might call order down the way thunder teases rain. Noah running to me with wet eyes and a brave mouth because he kept trying to cup gentleness in small hands that always leaked. Logan sticky with batter and faith, looking up like broken things were only puzzles I had not yet solved. And when I told them to settle, the word fell dull on the boards, the way a hammer sounds on rotten timber, and I knew the house could tell I was lying. Sarah's touches clung where I could not look long. The blue flowered plates her grandmother carried packed in straw, the curtains she hemmed by lamplight while I shaved a table leg to the clean line she liked. The rocker waiting in its corner as if she might come through the door, dusted with flour and laughter. And I let the dust do the work of time because I could not move any of it without feeling I was moving her, and I cooked meals that filled bellies and starved hearts, pans that once held stews thick enough to slow sadness now holding eggs welded to iron, and flapjacks black as coins hammered thin with regret. I had tried to hire solutions because money, when a man is tired, puts on love's coat and walks around pretending. The school marm with a mouthful of straight pins who lasted half a day before Wyatt's bluntness and Owen's mischief snipped her patience to threads. The widow who made it through one night of Logan's nightmares and our heavy quiet. Even the mail-order hope who admired a man good with an axe until the door opened on. 5 boys and my grief, and she backed down the steps like a person who had met a bear in daylight, and each departing wagon left the cabin leaning as if a beam had been pulled and the roof was learning how to sag. Outside the peaks wore thin white scarves, and the wind changed taste in the back of my mouth. That iron hint which tells a mountaineer that the sky has finished thinking and chosen its mood, and I should have sent the boys out to split lengths and bank the coals and see to the shutters. But I sat in Sarah's chair with my hands idle at last, turning the ring as if it were a locket that might open and sing, trying to name the hunger that gnawed at us when supper was warm. Something that is not heat and not softness, and yet is both. And finding no word I dared say aloud. So when Logan climbed my knee and announced his ordinary hunger, I breathed the sweetness of syrup and little boy hair, and wondered how the smallest still trusted me to be a door and not a wall. And the wind pressed its shoulder to the logs, like it meant to come through and rearrange us, and I did not yet know the storm would deliver someone small who would do precisely that without raising her voice. Before dark closed the distance between the pines and our roof, I heard a human sound braided into the storm, and once you hear a sound like that, there is no going back to your chair. I have lived long enough among these ridges to tell the languages of wind apart. The high-wire hum of a clear night, the belly-deep moan that makes elk hold still in their beds, the ragged whistle when ice takes an edge, and the howl that slammed our shutters that evening had the hard purpose storms get when they mean to teach. And while the boys dragged billets to the hearth, and I dropped the bar and needled pegs into the shutter braces with the same hands that once lifted Sarah over a puddle as if the whole earth might stain her hem, the gale beat the cabin as if to test each joint. And just when I judged us ready to ride the first fury, Logan tugged my sleeve with that look children get when they know they are not wrong, and he whispered that someone was crying out there in the white. At first, all I heard was the big ocean of it, the sift and hiss where snow poured off the eaves, the low drum on the roof where it piled, the quick crack of a limb surrendering to weight. But then, thin as thread, through heavy cloth came a sound that did not belong to weather, and a cold that had nothing to do with air ran under my coat. And I told Wyatt and Liam to rope in and not do anything foolish unless it had to be done, which is the whole definition of our trade. And the three of us pushed into a world the storm had erased and begun to redraw. There is a way to walk in such snow to keep from falling into your fear, a way to lean your weight into the wind and borrow its strength instead of quarrel with it. And we spoke little because voices die in a blow unless you put them on a line. And we read the slope by landmarks no stranger could name even in sun, the witch-bent spruce, the rock shaped like a sleeping dog, the dip where the trail finds its breath again. And then the coach rose out of the white like something the mountain had dreamed and dropped, canted on its side in a cradle of drift, one wheel still turning like a clock that had not been told the news, the driver already on his still road. And in the hush that sits at the heart of a blizzard, I heard a girl's voice ask please with a steadiness that would have made a lawman stand straighter. She was small, blue traveling dress torn and heavy with melt, hair in wet strings, hands steady on the bleeding head of an older woman who breathed like a bellows with a rip in it. And when I knelt, she looked into me with a kind of age no child should be asked to carry. And she told me the man's arm was wrong, and the woman's words were wandering, and she did not cry because all of her was busy doing. And I am not ashamed to say I obeyed her first before I took charge, because there are authorities even a storm recognizes, and one of them is courage. We cut a travois from coach boards and rope, and I took the woman because she was fading fast, while the boys steadied the gentleman who muttered about papers as if ink could stop snow, and the little one kept our pace with the blunt resolve of a soldier, despite boots not made for mountains. And when the door opened on our heat, the other boys shrank from the sudden crowding of strangers, but I saw how her glance, quick and quiet, measured the room, the hearth, the stretch of floor where a pallet would be kindest, the table where a water cup might live. And she went to work without asking what was allowed. And in that moment, though I did not know her name, something in the room came level. Through the night, the wind rattled its big shoulders against our walls, but inside the fire found its voice, and the boys their hands, and we turned the main room into a ward, the way a family turns a day into a life, with small tasks done in the right order. And whenever the injured stirred, it was the girl who reached them first with cloth or water or a tone that said a body is not alone, and I had the strange sensation a man gets when a tune he has not heard in years slips back into his ear and he hums before he knows the words. And I stood a long time beneath the mantel looking at the little wooden horses I had carved in better seasons and felt my knife hand wake as if from a long sleep. By morning, the wind had worn itself down to a steady grinding, and the snow had climbed our sills like a white tide, and Mrs. Davidson, the older woman, was worse in that terrible way that pretends to be rest, and the gentleman, Patterson, kept asking for laudanum we did not possess, and his satchel we could not fetch. And when I stepped toward the stove, ready to meet the usual ruin, I caught the smell of bacon, not yet bitter, and pancakes not yet surrendering, and I froze, because hope, starved long, can frighten a man like a shout in church. And I turned to see the small stranger on a stool, Sarah's apron over her torn dress, her braid neat as a promise, and without looking at me, she said good morning, as if it were a fact and not a wish, and told me who had drunk and who would. And the room that had been merely ours for 3 years answered her like a key had turned in a long-stuck lock. I had not meant for that apron to be taken from its nail, and when Wyatt bristled, I felt the old ache rise, yet I heard myself say, let it be used. And a door I had not known I'd closed swung on its hinges. I have seen men quiet a spooked team with nothing but breath and the exact weight of a palm, yet I had never watched order pulled from a room by the simple gravity of a child who did not insist. And as my boys drifted toward the table with the wary gait of colts, not certain the pasture is safe, the smell of browned batter and bacon coaxed them into remembering they were alive, and Wyatt's jaw set when he saw Sarah's skillet at work and the bow of a stranger's apron in our kitchen, the look he gave me saying more than words, that to eat from our dead was to betray her. And my first swallow was hard, but I looked from the pan to the girl and felt a decision waiting in me, and I told him that a thing made for use grows thin if it goes idle, and that his mother said recipes were meant for cooking, and he did not like it. Yet he let his breath come back, which is as much victory as you can expect of a grieving boy. Owen, who tests every fence, tossed a remark like a pebble to see what circles it made about strangers and kitchens and who has the say. And the girl, instead of bristling, turned quietly and set the best portion on his tin with such unadorned care that mischief slid off his face like mud in rain. And Noah, who listens for a room's true key, let his shoulders drop. And even Logan, too young to name any of it, leaned toward the plate the way a plant leans toward sun. And while I tasted butter threaded with memory, I felt that small, warm sting behind the eyes and decided for once not to blink it away. When the washing up began, she moved through our jumble in a pattern that made sense. Water here, cloths there, utensils stacked by shape as if the world could relearn its alphabet. And reaching past a cupboard I had not opened since spring, after the funeral she found the leather-bound book I had not wanted to see. My wife's hand gathered in one place, flowery notes, careful measures, names written beside certain dishes like blessings. Noah's favorite when he is poorly beside chicken soup, extra molasses for Wyatt because of that face he makes when cornbread goes dry. And the sight of my life cataloged in Sarah's script made my mouth go dusty. Yet when the girl looked up already apologizing and offered to put it back, I heard myself say, "No, use it," because a book is not a grave, and I stood there and felt the past walk back into the room by way of salt and butter. She did not copy blindly. She read like a person studying a map of a country she meant to help settle, asking where the oven keeps its sweet spot and how our flour behaves when weather turns, and what the boys will eat when their hearts hurt. And by midday, she set down a stew with dumplings that did not sulk and cornbread that did not break into apology, and the boys ate without the noisy armor they used to keep disappointment from biting. And in that quiet, I learned again the old truth that food cooked with attention teaches a room to hear its better self. And the rafters, which had been listening to our emptiness for years, seemed to take a deeper breath. I tried not to stare because men who haul logs and set traps and lift wives gone light with fever do not enjoy being caught learning from a child. Yet my eyes went to her hands while she knotted a strip for Patterson's sling and bathed the old woman's forehead with water that was neither too warm nor too cool. And I realized there are measures more exact than any rule, that care holds the temperature you learn with your skin. And when evening folded along the windows and the storm leaned in to listen, I sat under the mantel and watched the boys go to their beds without the old flint in them, and I thought how strange it was that quiet can be more than the absence of sound, that it can be the presence of rightness. At first light, the older woman's breathing went ragged, then small, then terribly smooth, in the way that has a finish in it, and I have watched cattle go like that, and once a man, but it is different when a stranger dies under your roof, and the girl did not flinch or wail or pretend the mountain could be telegraphed for a doctor. She folded the hands and told Logan that hurt does not follow where some people go, not in the old way. And the words fell like water into a cracked cup. And when Wyatt and I shouldered the shovels and went to the patch that heaves least, I told myself, there are two kinds of storms, the kind the sky brings and the kind you carry, and only one of them was easing. That night, with snow in our cuffs and sorrow tucked close like a live thing, she opened a book I had not dared touch, and my wife spoke from the margins. The family Bible had sat on the shelf as a monument, leather worked smooth by hands that were not mine anymore, and the pressed flowers Sarah tucked between psalms still kept a ghost of summer under their brown skins. And when the girl settled into the rocker, startling me with how naturally another body fit that curve, and opened to a page with Sarah's small notes breathing along the gutter, it felt as if a window we had boarded long ago came quietly unlatched, and the air that entered did not freeze us but cleared what we had been breathing. And she read not only the verse but the sentences my wife had scattered like seeds. Wyatt took 3 steps today and reached for this book like he already knew what anchors a life. Liam read his first story straight through and asks about bridges no one can see. Owen drew a butterfly that looked like a map of joy, if such a thing could be drawn. Noah cradled a broken fledgling, as if someone I cannot see had taught his hands. Logan's laugh is a bell you can hear from the barn. I do not know what loosens a boy's throat when it has been packed with hard, old things, but I watched mine unburden themselves the way snow slips from a fur when sun touches it, and they traded small, warm stories as if handing each other live animals to keep in their pockets. What songs she sang for bread, and which for beans, and how she smelled of soap and flour and being forgiven before you had earned it. And when Noah's face broke, and he said he could not see her face in his mind anymore, as if forgetting a feature were a second betrayal, I went to the bed and lifted the box I had taught myself to leave alone, The photographs, the letters, the ribbon that still holds her if you keep your eyes closed. And I set our wedding picture on the table and let my sons find their mother with their fingers. Wyatt looked at the set of her jaw and recognized courage he had mistaken for mere hardness in himself. Liam smiled at the light in her eyes and held that smile like a lesson, because brightness can be learned as surely as sums. Owen traced the fine laugh lines and said she must have found joy even when the dough would not rise. Noah pressed his cheek to the frame like a calf at a gate and breathed as if air had returned to the room. Logan made the small sound a child makes when a puzzle piece drops home and you did not know you'd been puzzling. And the girl said she was beautiful without the smallest flicker of envy, and the word beautiful did not shatter us like glass. It laid itself on the table and made a path for night. After they slept and Patterson drifted in that weary orbit of pain and exhaustion, I took up my knife and a scrap of pine, and my hands remembered their old music before my head permitted it, shaving curls that smelled like the inside of a good day, while the girl threaded a needle and closed a tear with stitches so small they felt like truth. And we sat with the fire between us and let silence be full instead of empty. And when she asked what I was making, I told her I did not yet know, because sometimes the hand must go first and the heart follows. And she said her father used to call making a beautiful thing a way of praying with your fingers. And I thought how I had stopped after Sarah died, as if beauty were an offense against sorrow, and I felt ashamed of the unnecessary wonders I had withheld from my boys in the name of need. The next gray afternoon, I cleared the bench in the workshop that had become a shed for tools and failure, raised a small storm of sawdust ghosts, set the plane to a board, and began the first true piece since we laid Sarah down. And though I told myself it was only a bed to lift a child from a pallet, the measure and fit and shave felt like laying planks across a ravine I had allowed to widen between who I had been and what I had let us become. And when she came to the door and saw, she smiled in a way that made me feel not looked at but seen. And the word that slipped out when I said why, family, came without permission, and I let it stand. By evening, the sky had decided it had proved its point and lay breathing quietly around the cabin. And inside I felt another weather change because routines began to form, not as rules scolded into boys, but as trails worn by many feet returning to water. Liam reading recipes to her as if instructions were a story with a right telling. Owen choosing thread the way a painter chooses a sky. Noah measuring out comfort that needed no bottle to be strong. Logan setting the table with a care that turned wood and tin into a kind of altar. And none of it replaced their mother. It only gave her lessons new hands to ride, and the wild animal that had lived in my chest lay down and let me breathe around it. With the bed half built and a question too large to keep behind my teeth, I decided to ask before the world arrived with answers I could not accept. I had been planning the final rail of the little bed, sending pale curls to the floor that smelled like the inside of a remembered summer, when the thought that had hunted my sleep for 3 nights finally shouldered past my caution, and I told myself that a man who waits on perfect timing will die with the most important words still in his mouth. So I set the plane down, turned to the girl who was rubbing the wood with sand fine as flour, and asked if she could imagine staying where the wind spoke our names. And the stove found its easy voice at dawn, and the boys, God help them, had already begun to stitch her into their rough hearts. And as I said it, I felt the cabin lean to listen, as if the logs themselves had been waiting for me to stop being careful. Her eyes, which could look older than years when a body hurt or a pan needed turning at the right breath, flickered with a fear I recognized because it lives inside anyone who has learned that good things sometimes vanish at daybreak. And she asked whether I was certain, whether men changed their minds when the law stepped into a room, and whether boys tired of sharing when the sweetness of novelty dried up. And I told her what I knew, that blood is not the only grammar a family speaks, that love and choice can conjugate a home into being even when papers lag behind, and that I would find whatever courthouse door needed knocking and knock until the hinges learned my name. I did not get the yes right away, because wise children do not throw their hearts across a river without first testing the current, and she was wise. So instead she ran a hand across the bed slat and said softly that it felt like something made to last, that it felt like the kind of promise Wood understands. And I took that answer the way a farmer takes the first green blade after a brutal winter, as proof that more might follow if the weather of our lives held. And then, because a man sometimes needs his sons to speak what his courage has not finished saying, The workshop door banged, and 5 boys fell in a tangle of boots and hope and told the secret they had been saving, that the storeroom behind the kitchen was not a storeroom anymore. We crowded the hall in a rush that would have toppled a lighter house, and there it was, a room pressed into readiness by many small hands, the scrubbed walls wearing Owen's mountain drawings like windows, the shelf Liam had squared standing proud under the weight of a few books that had waited too long to be chosen, the curtains Noah had coaxed from stubborn cloth hanging true in the frame, the bed Wyatt had tightened and braced to carry more than sleep, and on the table the little horse Logan had given up because sometimes a boy understands he must part with a treasure to make room for a greater one. And I watched her look at all of it with a tenderness that asked permission to be happy, and at last dared to be. When she turned to me and said she wanted to belong, if belonging meant days that were built from use and kindness instead of fear and leaving, the cheer went up so suddenly the rafters shook, and I let the noise walk the rooms like light because we had been dim too long. And after the clatter settled and the fire found its steady voice again, I felt the next weather gathering at the edge of certainty. For rescue does not always arrive with rescue in its hands, and morning would bring men with duty stitched to their coats and questions sharp as saw teeth. We slept with joy under our tongues and woke to hooves in the yard and the law at the door. And I learned again how quickly a room can tilt. At dawn, the cold bit so clean, it made the distance ring. And when the sheriff swung down and said the word missing, the way men say it when they expect to find bodies, stiff as iron, I felt the room we had just built quake under a strain it was only beginning to bear. And as he took out his notebook and wrote down the name Rosie Fletcher, his face rearranged itself into the look the world wears when it is about to declare a thing improper, and my mouth went eager before my sense, and I told him she belonged here, which is not an argument a statute recognizes, yet it is sometimes the only argument that has any fire in it. He spoke of wards and papers and the way governments keep children from drifting through the cracks men fall into, and I wanted to hate him for saying it, but I could not, because his duty had a clean edge and he was not cruel, only certain, and certainty can bruise even when it means to heal. And then the girl stepped onto the porch with her chin level, like someone about to hear a sentence, and she said she was already properly placed. And for a heartbeat, I believed that the right words might rearrange an officer's orders, but orders are built to withstand good sentences. So he repeated that Denver would have to decide. I almost said I would marry the first willing soul the city threw in my path, because I could feel how quickly a man will trade his own comfort when a child is about to be unstitched from him. And the sheriff, to his credit, did not laugh. He only said that even a wife might not out-argue an empty file. And it was at that moment, while the smoke lifted from our chimney like a question, and my boys grouped around the girl the way saplings shelter a flame, that Mr. Patterson, gray and shaking, but finally certain of his courage, told what he had not told, that there were papers with a name and a trust and a line in a will that spoke of emergency guardians. And for one sharp beat, Hope stepped into the yard, dressed as ink and seals. We had 24 hours to beat snow and chance and the mountain's appetite for whatever it is not ready to give back. And though I have hunted through drifts and under deadfall and along slides for cattle and once for a neighbor's son, I have never searched with a clock wound tight as that day's. And we made a grid and worked the knowns, where metal lies heavy, where leather sinks, how wind will teach paper to fly. And every time a shadow under the crust looked promising and turned out to be only a stubborn root, I tasted the copper, fear a man tastes when he is using his strength against time and knows time is the stronger animal. It was Liam, quiet with his thoughts in a way that fools those who think only noise moves the world, who began to follow the scattered bills and correspondence the storm had worried loose, reading the wind like a ledger, and the trail bent us into a thicket tight with laurel and snow, where something darker than bark crouched, and when Wyatt and I cut through the branches and dragged out Patterson's satchel, water-stained, brass dull, buckles still holding as if they knew what they carried, my legs let me sit in the snow and breathe like a bellows, because a man's body often knows the prayers answered before his mouth can form the words. Back in the cabin, the sheriff read slowly, as if respect for paper might teach him a new mercy, and he said the documents were sound and filed and witnessed, and that what we had now was permission to ask, not possession, which is the difference between a door unlocked and a door opened, and even while relief ran soft along my bones, I understood the next hill. Education, character, the matter of a woman's guidance in a house full of boys and one girl crossing into all that a girl must learn. And it was a hard list. But hardness had stopped frightening me because I had just watched my family pull a name and a future out of a mountain that did not want to give either back. Denver was a long road, and judges are mountains of their own. But before we could carry our case to a bench, we had to carry our hearts through a city I know, longer knew, and find a way to answer questions I had been dodging since the day I became a widower. So we loaded our gear and the papers and the fragile, enormous hope that had our fingerprints all over it, and we turned our backs on the ridge for as long as it would take to fight for a place to return to. Denver had grown teeth and wires and a hunger for coin since the last time I had the patience to look it in the eye. And I felt the boys tighten the way colts tighten when a train goes by, their mountain feet uncertain on boards that had never smelled sap. And as we checked into the hotel, whose halls felt like other people's breathing, I told myself I would do any awkward thing required to keep us sewn together, even if it meant standing at church socials like a stump with a hat, saying the indecently practical truth to women who did not know us. That I sought a wife, not because my heart had lit on a person, but because a court might want a certain silhouette to feel comfortable signing its name. I learned quickly that honesty can sound like offense, even when it is honest, because words have to cross the distance between two lives before they can settle. And as I shook hands and watched eyes cloud or glitter with curiosity, and then cool when the mountain and the number of children were mentioned, I understood that what we needed was not someone brave enough to step into a ready-made story, but a different story altogether. One that did not ask a stranger to carry the weight of ghosts and boys and geography in exchange for a paper's blessing. That evening, in the parlor, where wallpaper roses climbed a wall that had never known weather, Rosie sat beside me with the tired poise she wears when the day has tugged at her from too many directions. And she said what I had been ashamed to speak, that there had to be a way to promise the court a girl would not grow up with only rough hands to teach her delicate work without putting my name in a book beside a woman whose smile I could not yet trust. And when she spoke Mrs. Henderson's name and Mrs. Murphy's and the preacher's wife and wove them into a net strong enough to catch the judge's doubt, I felt the kind of relief a man feels when he discovers the bridge he needs has been there all along, only hidden by fog and pride. We sent telegrams that carried our mountain into town, one string of words at a time, and by afternoon, the wires began to bring the ridge back to us, with yes after yes from women who had helped stitch our life, even when I had been too thick with grief to call it help. And the stack of letters and promises and testimonies grew into a small paper mountain on Hartwell's desk. And the lawyer, who had the look of a man who has put too many broken lives back together to be surprised by much, leaned back and said that sometimes a court needs to be taught a better definition of family. The boys found their roles even in the city, Wyatt standing at my shoulder like a wall with eyes, Liam mapping the hearing in his head like a chessboard, Owen sketching faces in the lobby to keep his hands from fidgeting, Noah carrying the quiet that keeps a room from tipping, Logan falling asleep against my side, in a way that reminded me the world is simpler when a child believes you are a safe place. And as the day before the hearing drew down, I laid the papers out on the small hotel table the way a man lays out his tools before building something he does not yet know how to build. And I told the truth to the night that I was afraid, and the night told the truth back that being afraid is only proof that you are close to something worth doing. Morning came like a bell, and we walked into a room made for judgment with our hands open, because you cannot hold a child or a lie when your hands are already full. The courtroom held the kind of polished quiet that tries to teach you how small you are, and the judge's eyes were the color of high ice that has learned to reflect more than it shows. And when he asked whether I understood what I was asking, guardianship with the intention of adoption for a girl not of my blood, with 5 sons under a roof, 3 days' ride from an ordinary school, I said the only honest thing, that I understood the stakes even if I did not yet know the answers to every procedural riddle his bench could conjure. Hartwell laid out the letters like a deck meant for building rather than gambling, and the judge read Mrs. Henderson's promise to come each month with knowledge tucked under her arm and kindness in her voice, read Mrs. Murphy's oath to keep Rosie supplied with what a girl needs when a girl becomes more girl and less child, read the preacher's wife's neat lines about lessons and hymns and the steady education a small community can provide when it remembers to be one, and while he read the room's temperature changed by 1 unmeasurable degree, the way spring first touches a field none of us had believed could green again. He asked about sums and school in winter and the moral shape of a house, where one soft voice had gone silent too soon, and my sons, who used to hide behind me or storm ahead of me but rarely stand exactly beside me, spoke one by one in the steady grammar their mother had taught them. Wyatt about anger tamed into protection, Liam about books shared like bread, Owen about art yoked to discipline, Noah about the ordinary mercies that keep a child asleep through the night, Logan about pancakes and stories and the mysterious safety a sister brings simply by existing where she did not exist before. And I watched the judge listening not only with his ears, but with some long muscle that runs through a person and remembers what it is to be moved. When Rosie stood, small and terribly brave, and said that with us she was not an obligation, but a choice, I tried to keep my eyes on the seal over the bench because a man who cries in public sometimes makes people doubt his strength. But strength and tears are not enemies, and I learned that late, so I let a few go and did not apologize for them, because the girl had just told the room the truest thing I had ever heard, that family is not always a fact first. Sometimes it is a decision that becomes a fact by being lived, and the judge, who must have heard 1,000 speeches meant to sway him, looked as if someone had opened a window he had kept closed for years. He did not hammer his gavel into a miracle. The world rarely gives us that simplicity, but he spoke with a care that felt like a hand on a shoulder, granting guardianship with the understanding that we would return with proofs as the seasons turned. Reports of study and health, notes from the women who would carry the teachings I could not carry. And he signed where signatures have the power to make what is already true legal. And when the clerk handed me copies, I held them not like trophies, but like tools, because I knew there would always be another repair, another season to steward, another piece of this house to build, so it could carry what we had chosen to carry. We went home not as 6 people surviving beside one another, but as a shape with a name, and the mountain, which can be hard on pretenders, greeted us with weather that promised work rather than warning. Returning up the pass with the boys blowing into their hands and Rosie leaning into the wind like a girl who had learned the trick of being both light and unmovable, I felt the cabin step out of the trees, not as a refuge only, but as a partner in the work ahead, and the door, which had once swung open on chaos and hunger, opened now on a kind of purposeful tumble. Morning lists chalked above the peg rail and the table crowded not with confusion, but with projects that made sense of hands. Mending in one corner and sums in another, a loaf proofing near the stove, a sketch half finished where the light is best. We did not become miraculous. We became faithful, which is the quieter miracle, and days braided themselves into a rope we could pull against. Lessons read aloud while onions softened, chores that rotated like the earth so no one bore the same weight too long. Sunday evenings with the preacher when he could reach us, and with the Bible's margins when weather kept him away. And a small envelope jar on the shelf labeled Rosie's School, to remind all of us that future is not a luxury when you love a child, it is a duty. And the boys, each in his way, began to grow toward the shape their mother had prophesied in those notes we kept rereading when nights felt longer than they should. Wyatt found work for the force that once broke things, turning it into fence straight and gate true, and a gentleness with livestock that looks like command to people who do not know the difference. Liam wrote away for lessons and circled words he could not yet define, in a careful hand that looked like a man trying to build a bridge to his own mind. Owen learned to slow his eye enough to let his hand tell the truth about light. Noah discovered that being soft does not mean being fragile, and that sometimes he could quiet a storm in the room with only a touch. Logan declared himself official taster of all new recipes, and took the job so seriously we sometimes had to pretend to argue him out of a 4th bite. And Rosie, who had arrived with loss folded under her ribs like a secret, unfolded day by day into a girl who knew where the clean cloths lived and how to read a doctor's note when one could be got and how to ask the kind of question that turns a boy's pride into partnership. And on afternoons when the sky had the color that means weather is thinking about changing again, she would take Sarah's locket in hand and tell the room out loud that gratitude is not the same as owing, that she could be thankful without being afraid, and the words settled into the boards like oil, making them shine. We did not tell the mountain we had won anything. We asked it to let us earn our keep, and it did, sending lambing nights too cold for forgetting, and springs where mud swallowed boots to the ankle. But the work did not hollow us. It gave us a place to put our strength, and every nail set, every loaf risen, every page dog-eared in the school books was another line in the proof we would someday hand back to the judge or to anyone who raised an eyebrow at the sound of our name. A year is both long and quick, And when the date came round that made what we had chosen official in the eyes of those who require such things, I reached into a box I had not opened since we left for Denver with fear clenched in it like a fist. On the morning that made a circle of our first year, the light fell through the kitchen window in that thick way it gets when flour is in the air and something is right. And I told the children to sit because I had words that were heavier than most and a small package that had waited longer than any of us. And I said that before a judge ever writes your names in the same line, a house already knows who belongs to it. But that sometimes a piece of gold helps a heart remember when winter gets loud. And I placed Sarah's locket in Rosie's hands without the old stab of fear that giving it might erase what had been, because grief had taught me at last that sharing a memory is not the same as spending it. She opened it, and the two small faces inside, one the young woman who taught me the shape of joy, and one all of us pressed together last month, trying not to blink at the same time, seemed to lean toward each other, as if time itself had been waiting for this meeting, and her tears came in that good way that waters whatever needs growing, and the boys reached for her with the rough tenderness brothers learn when they have been allowed to practice it. And for a minute, the kitchen sounded like a small church without a preacher, just ordinary people naming their blessings. I said aloud what I had been, learning in silence, that being a father after loss is not a matter of holding on with white knuckles. It is a matter of opening both hands in the right direction day after day, and the boys looked at me as if I had told them something they had always suspected. And after we ate, and the chores ran their usual circuit, I stepped out into the yard and let the mountains have a look at the man I had become since we last spoke honestly. The wind came down in a way that means there will be weather again soon, because there is always weather again soon, and I thought of the judge and the sheriff and the papers folded in oilcloth in the strongbox, and I felt no anger toward any of it. Only a steady willingness to prove and prove again, as often as the world required, that what we had built was not lucky or temporary but sound, and I turned back toward the door because sound houses are made sound daily, not once. Inside, Rosie was showing Logan how to stitch a small tear so the mending would not eat at the cloth around it, and I watched his tongue stick out the way it does when he is trying. I mean it hard, and it struck me like a clean nail that this is the whole work. To teach a child not to rip further what life has already torn, to make strong what was weak without calling the weakness shame, to hand them a tool and then step back so they can feel their own hands learn the lesson. And when he tied off the thread, he looked up as if he had become a little taller, and maybe he had. Toward evening, with the year folded neatly behind us and the new one opening like a door a good wind has just pushed, we heard hooves again. And this time they did not bring threat. They brought a letter with questions inside it we had not thought to ask. The writer was one of the preacher's boys, thin and cheerful, in that way boys get when a long errand makes them feel like men. And the envelope he handed me wore Hartwell's cramped hand on the outside and a seal I broke with a thumb that did not shake. And inside was a note that began with congratulations, and then turned a corner I had not expected, telling us that the estate's old partner had discovered among the rescue's salvaged items a smaller packet sealed and addressed to Rosie in her father's hand, delayed by misfiling and the slow business of offices, but now come home to its mark. And my first feeling was not fear or excitement, but the solemn acknowledgement that love sometimes travels slowly but refuses to be lost. We gathered at the table that had learned to hold so many kinds of weight, and she opened the thin paper and read quietly, while the boys leaned without meaning to, and her lips moved around words meant for a future her father could not describe, but believed in anyway. Words about the kind of woman he hoped she would learn from, and the kind of man he hoped would stand behind her while she learned. Words about money as a tool and not a master, about a name that could be kept or changed without guilt, depending on where she felt safest resting it, and tucked inside a second sheet in a clerk's hand, spoke of family in California that might still be found on a far branch if she ever wished to look. I felt no tug to defend what was ours, because I had finally learned the difference between possession and belonging does not fear inquiry. So I told her we would follow any trail she wanted when the season was right, that a family that is strong can bear the weight of a past examined. And the boys, bless them, surprised me not at all by nodding hard and then bending immediately to the most practical questions. What train would we take? Who would feed the stock? Whether letters could make the first handshake before miles had their say, and the room filled with that bright busyness hope brings when it ties on an apron. Night came on gentle and we read aloud from Sarah's Bible, not the sad parts, but the parts about finding and being found. And when the lamp burned low, I stepped outside with Wyatt and let him ask the question that had been climbing his throat all evening, whether seeking her father's people meant she might someday choose another roof. And I told him the truth, that love lives with risk the way mountains live with weather, that our work is to be so clearly her chosen place that any choice she makes will be a going out from strength rather than a fleeing from lack. And I saw the idea settle heavy, then fit him better, like a coat that needs a minute to learn a shoulder. We slept with travel on our tongues, but not yet in our bones, because spring still had work for us here, and in the dark I reached for the space in the bed where grief used to lie wide as a second body and found only the ordinary ache of a man who has used himself well. And I thanked the woman who was gone, and the girl who had come, and the boys who had become who they were becoming. And I must have fallen asleep with a smile because I woke with one, which is not a small mercy in a world that keeps its teeth sharp. Morning would bring chores and a list, and beyond the list a journey, and beyond the journey an answer. We did not yet know how to frame, which is exactly the place a story should pause. We made a plan that could hold both work and wondering, letters first, and careful questions next, and travel after lambing when the passes would stop trying to teach us humility every afternoon. And as we folded each step into the next, the house moved with us, as if it too were learning how to keep balance while looking far. And I thought how different this felt from the life we had been surviving a year in a storm ago, how then every day had been a wall to lean against, and now every day was a gate to swing. When I sat the boys down to explain the errands they'd need to shoulder while we were away, Wyatt to count the fence posts and the days, Liam to keep the ledger straight and the stove whispering its small arithmetic, Owen to draw the spring creek so he could paint it better when we returned, Noah to keep peace with the hens and with his brothers, using the soft authority that always answered to him, Logan to be official letter carrier and taster-in-chief of any new recipe our neighbors dared drop off. I watched them absorb the instructions without the old wildness rising, and I understood, in a single breath, that the question I had asked in the workshop months ago had been answered again and again each day since, not by papers alone, but by practice. We hitched the wagon the week the past decided travel was merely difficult and not foolhardy, and as we climbed I told myself, and the mountain, and the empty air, that I was not leaving to find a better family, but to honor the one we were by letting the girl learn the curve and root of her name. And the wind shifted in that small, approving way it sometimes does when a man has managed to say the truest version of the thing he has been circling, and the team leaned, and the wheels bit, and home slid behind the shoulder of the ridge without complaint. At the final turn before the world drops toward town, I set the brake and stood to look, not back, but forward. And I felt the weight of all our pages, Bible margins, and legal filings and letters folded and refolded, stack themselves into a single, sturdy ledger line. And I laughed, which surprised the boys, because laughter had been slow to return to me, and I told them that every map worth carrying has blank space at the edge, and that it was time we wrote in some of ours, with boot tracks and ink and whatever else it might take. So this is where I will leave us for a breath. The wagon nosed toward a road with questions laid along it like mile markers, the girl with the locket at my side and 5 boys arrayed behind us like a living windbreak, the mountain at our back, not as something escaped, but as something brought along in our bones, and the future out ahead like weather we mean to meet on our feet. And if you want to know what name we found in California, and whether the old and the new braided into something strong enough to hold when the next hard season tested it, and who was standing on the porch when we turned home again with dust on our coats and new letters in our pockets, you will have to walk the next miles with us because I cannot and will not tell that ending until we have earned it. A telegram waited in the next town with a single line from a name none of us expected to see, and when the clerk read it aloud, my hands found the edge of the counter because the past had just reached out, alive and inconvenient, to change the shape of the road under our wheels.